Hello Nancy Drew fans, welcome back to yet another book to game comparison video. Today I am going to be talking about The Silent Spy. So the first thing we'll look at is the book. This is The Clue of the Whistling Bagpipes and is part of the yellow hardback series and was printed in 1964. And then following that little analysis, I will talk about the game, which is, of course, The Silent Spy and was released in 2013. As always, a spoiler alert is in effect. I don't have more to say about that, it's just consider yourselves warned, things will be talked about. So with that, let's dive on in. So we'll start by looking at the book, which I've already noted is entitled The Clue of the Whistling Bagpipes. It is book number 41 of the Nancy Drew Mystery Stories series, and we haven't had one of these books in a while. I think the last time was The Captive Curse, which I guess wasn't all that long ago, but prior to that, The Secret of the Old Clock, and then before that, The Secret of Shadow Ranch. So the usage of the Mystery Stories series are sort of far and few between, or at least the yellow hardback stories from that series. So what is this story? We have Nancy, who is going to Scotland with her dad and her two best friends, Bess and George. And she's going there to meet her maternal great-grandmother, who she's never met before, but she's heard many stories about. So she's really excited for that meeting. She's also going there because she was due to receive an heirloom, and it has gone missing. So naturally, Nancy plans on tracking it down. But before Nancy even gets to leave, she stumbles into some trouble back at home. And this is sort of as a result of something that was meant to be nice. Bess had submitted Nancy's picture into this magazine, which is sort of an international magazine. It's a photography magazine, and Nancy sort of gets swarmed by people who recognize her and want her autograph. And it starts with a child who recognizes her and wants her signature. And Nancy goes along with this request, and then she's hounded by a bunch of kids. And she decides she's only going to give signatures to kids, not to adults. However, a strange man decides to buy her signature from the first little boy who had asked her to sign a piece of paper. And this is very strange. Nancy demands that he not take it. He runs off with it, and it turns up in Scotland, of all places, and is used for nefarious means, which Nancy discovers later on. And then on top of that, still before she even boards the plane, she's having a chat with Ned, who tells her about a mystery he heard about that's taking place in Scotland, and it is about sheep that have been disappearing. Now, very strange. And then while Nancy's in Scotland, she encounters the criminals involved with that plot. So our characters in this book include Paul Petrie, who we're also going to call the Red-Bearded Man because he wears a disguise, and I'll talk more about that in a little while. Mr. Dewar, who they meet in Scotland. Fiona Fraser, who is a young lady who rides with Nancy and Bess and George for part of the journey. Lady Douglas, the great-grandmother of Nancy. And Tweety, who is her butler. So Nancy's having this crazy adventure in Scotland. She's starting off in Glasgow and slowly making her way through Loch Lomond and Edinburgh all the way to Fort William. And she has these strange encounters in every place. And one of those encounters, as already noted, is with the sheep shearing smugglers. And shearing is a big part of it. They are shearing their skins and sending those in the wool to the United States. And they're doing this illegally because they are not their own sheep. And they also happen to be involved to a degree with the missing brooch, and this is the heirloom that Nancy was supposed to receive. Their plot was foiled accidentally, and it never actually left the property, but Nancy learns of where it is, and both of those cases get resolved. So that is sort of a quick rundown of what's going on in The Clue of the Whistling Bagpipes. Now let's look at the game. So here we have The Silent Spy, game number 29 of the Nancy Drew Adventure Mystery Series. So in this case, Nancy has been convinced to go to Scotland to look into the death of her mother, Kate Drew, which appears to have been more than just the accident that her dad told her about. It turns out that Kate was a reporter as well as a spy who occasionally worked in Scotland. And Nancy's been invited essentially by a terrorist group, and they were involved with the original plot that Kate had foiled, but that had led to her untimely death. and they are constantly contacting Nancy and giving her little bits of recordings of her mom in exchange for her help. And saying her help is maybe not quite the right way to put it. They have her do initially small, minor things that aren't really hurting anybody. And once she's done those, she hears these clips about her mom. She winds up stopping her cooperation when she discovers, or when it becomes obvious that what they are asking of her isn't good. I mean, that's sort of what you expect of a terrorist group, so it's going to come at some point. And we actually get to choose as a player whether or not Nancy's going to go along with those actions, with those requests by the terrorist group called Revenant. And the other sort of main part of the story, not just the fact that Nancy's looking into her mom's death and the reason for her being brought there, but there's this old terror plot, the one that Kate was involved with. It appears to be reawakening, let's put it that way. And it involves a biological agent being used in Glasgow. So it's really quite a terrifying terrorist act that Nancy now has to try and thwart. So the characters in the game include Ewan MacLeod. This is Nancy's contact at Cathedral. Cathedral being the intelligence agency in Scotland, or sort of a branch of it. Alec Fell, who Nancy sort of encounters, she thinks, sort of accidentally initially at the train station. But he's a little bit more than that. He's what they call a skip tracer. He looks for people. And then we have Moira Chisholm, who is someone who Alec looked for Nancy, and she was someone who worked with Nancy's mum. And then Bridget Shaw, who is a young lady who spends a lot of time outside of the hotel, and turns out is not just a tourist or a visitor, but she is a spy by the name of Zoe Wolfe. So Nancy is trying to figure out what Revenant wants of her, where this terrorist plot is going, and she winds up getting help from most of her new acquaintances. They all work together, which is really quite lovely, and they do this collaboration to foil this attempted release of a chemical agent. And they also wind up stopping one of the plotters of this horrible scheme, who's Nancy's contact at Cathedral, Ewan MacLeod. So we've got a lot going on in the game in terms of Nancy learning about her mum, but also dealing with really quite a scary case. So now, let's do a comparison between the two stories, the novel and the game. So our titles are the first thing I like to look at, and they are quite different. We have the Whistling Bagpipes, or rather the clue of the Whistling Bagpipes, and the Silent Spy. Very different titles, and they should be quite different. The book has, again, this story about sheep going missing, and Nancy often hears a strange tune being played on bagpipes. And these whistling and tunes are signals for the smugglers, if you want to call them that, the thieves. They have multiple titles. So that is where that title comes from, and makes perfect sense for the book. The game, on the other hand, is about a spy. It has nothing to do with bagpipes, although there is a small inclusion of bagpipe in the game. But it's not really a focus of the game. The game focuses on a spy, and the silent spy is really a reference to a dead spy, which, it's horrible to say, is Nancy's mom. So, suitable titles for two very different stories. And speaking of different stories, let's talk briefly about the storylines. So for the book, Nancy is investigating the disappearance of sheep as well as a missing family heirloom, whereas the game has Nancy looking into her mother's death while trying to stop an act of terrorism. Our storylines are completely different. Two incredibly different plots. Our locations, however, are essentially the same. Nancy is moving through Scotland in both of them. They both take place in Glasgow and Loch Lomond. The book also has Nancy going to Edinburgh and Fort William, whereas in the game, Nancy also goes to Bearsden. So basically the same, which is really quite nice to see. And now let's look at characters. I contemplated whether or not I could actually do some overlap between characters, and I kind of could have, but I think it would have been too much of a stretch, so I didn't. So I'm looking at each character as either being just from the book or just from the game, which has become pretty commonplace at this point with the Her Interactive Nancy Drew series. So let's quickly get into these book characters. The first is Paul, or Paul Petrie. So he's this American who had bought Nancy's autograph from a young boy, and he uses it in Scotland with the help of his wife, and she's using them to forge checks, which is sort of a random side story when Paul's real story is about sheepskin and wool smuggling. So he's involved with that and doesn't want Nancy to go there. He threatens her as well. And when he's in Scotland, he wears a disguise. And Nancy recognizes him, but not as the fellow who bought her autograph. She just knows that he looks familiar. Next, we'll look at Mr. Dewar, who we don't get a first name for. He is a Scotsman. And Nancy, Bess, and George are accidentally given his hotel room when they first get to Glasgow because the Drew last name is so similar to Mr. Dewar. And there was a note in his room that the girls find, and their mystery senses start tingling. But then they go to their room, and then they sort of encounter Mr. Dewar a few more times, and he too is involved with the sheep thefts, and he tried to steal Lady Douglas's brooch. But then he dropped it in the estate's pond, so he was not entirely successful with that endeavor. So those are our two baddies for the book, and that's about it. It's just this duo. And then we have a few other characters who Nancy encounters and is involved with quite a bit in the story. So we'll talk about those three. So we'll start with Fiona. So she's a young girl from the Isle of Skye, and she joins Nancy, Bess, and George when they start to head toward Fort William. And Mr. Drew stays behind. He's got some other work to do before he can head in that direction. And she sort of winds up acting as a guide and an educator for them at various times in the story. She also winds up translating this Gaelic note, which they find and had to do with the smugglers. They were trying to communicate with each other in Gaelic, and so with Fiona's help, they sort of decode it. It's not perfectly clear, but they do manage to figure out the essence of what the note meant. And then we've got Lady Douglas. Again, this is Nancy's maternal great-grandmother. She had intended to bequeath a brooch to Nancy, but it goes missing shortly after she had worn it. And essentially what had happened is she was wearing it and it fell, and Mr. Dewar happened to see it. He went, grabbed it, and then he dropped it, and it wound up in, again, that pond on the estate. And Lady Douglas also really encourages Nancy to investigate, both searching for the heirloom as well as trying to figure out what's going on with the sheep and this bagpipe tune and whistling that she has heard a few times on her way to Fort William. And then the final book character we'll look at is Tweedy. He is the butler to Lady Douglas, and he winds up being accused of having stolen the brooch. This is a false accusation, though. This is just what Paul Petrie happens to say when he's caught, and this is to throw suspicion off himself, as well as off Mr. Dewar, who was the actual attempted thief of the brooch. So those are our book characters, and then we'll quickly go over the game characters. We'll start with Ewan MacLeod. He is Nancy's contact at the cathedral, and he provides her with access to the archives, as well as some spy gear, which is really cool. But he actually tricked Nancy into coming to Glasgow. He is not really who he says he is. He is working for the baddies. He's involved with Revenant. Then we have Alec, who is a skip tracer, and he gets pulled into Nancy's case by Revenant. He is actually meant to be a good guy, and he does want to help her, but his sister has been kidnapped. So he sort of follows their orders, such as taking her, or being involved with taking her suitcase, taking documents out of it. But this is because he's trying to find his sister and free her. But he turns, I shouldn't even say turns, because he's always actually ultimately a good guy, but he helps out Nancy and her other new acquaintances in the end. Then we have Moira Chisholm. So she's a retired reporter, and she was a colleague of Kate Drew's when they worked together at the newspaper in Glasgow. And they were also both involved with Cathedral together. And Moira has this horrible confession she has to make. And it was that back before Kate died, she had lied to Kate and had told her that she would get round-the-clock protection while in Scotland. And there was no one watching her back. And Moira feels deep regret for this. And she shares some other stories with Nancy, and Nancy learns that she had met Moira as an infant, and she had no idea. She didn't know that there was once a close bond between the two. And that's sort of a lovely, albeit sad, storyline. And then finally, we'll look at Bridget, slash Zoe. She is a spy who Nancy had actually spoken to back in The Phantom of Venice. She was Samantha Quick. This is very strange for me. I do have a hard time with this, but that's all I'm going to say about that. So Zoe Wolf uses the alias Bridget Shaw just to first get to know Nancy, sort of suss her out, learn what she can about her. And then Nancy uncovers her true identity, discovers she's a spy, or at least that she's not who she says she is. And as Zoe, she begrudgingly accepts, I don't know if I want to say help or interference from Nancy, but the two start working together and help figure out where the biochemicals are, trying to put a stop to this terror plot. And at the end of everything, she also takes off to help Alec find his sister Grace. So those are our characters. And yeah, like I said, I kind of thought I could have done some overlap with characters between book and game. And my consideration was Bridget slash Zoe with Fiona from the book, but really they're not the same person. It's just that they're both a young girl who Nancy befriends, if you want to say that, for the game. And I thought about Lady Douglas and sort of the relationship with Kate Drew, who I haven't even put in this list here because Nancy doesn't actually interact with her, but it's more that we're learning about the family, which is the point I've decided to add instead. So here we are seeing some overlap. So, and it's this idea of family history on the maternal side of Nancy's family. So both the book and the game focus on this element. The book, it involves Lady Douglas, who is Nancy's great-grandmother who lives in Scotland, and they meet and search for this missing heirloom. The game takes a very different direction with the family history. Rather than being on a great-grandmother, it's about Nancy's mum, who has died, and the circumstances that led to her death, and who Kate really was, and the fact that she was a spy. So there's some overlap, but the direction taken was different. I'll also talk about the different plots here. So we'll start with smuggling. So this is the main plot point of the book. It's about sheep smuggling, or it's about sheep stealing and the smuggling of their skins and wool. So the animals, and this, keep in mind, is not very nice to think about. The animals are sedated, stolen, and then they're killed, then skinned. So we've got this kind of gruesome plot. They actually find a sheep graveyard at one point, which is really horrible. And then these pelts and wool are then shipped illegally to the United States of America. So that's what the book's about. Whereas the game is about intelligence services and Nancy working with a spy agency to learn more about her deceased mom. So just wanted to sort of point out and really stress what the focus is of these two stories. We do have a little bit more overlap as far as location, which I mentioned earlier. You know, everything's set in Scotland and Nancy traveling around. And I just wanted to point out again that both stories involve Glasgow. They actually both start in Glasgow, with Nancy being able to travel to other places. And they both travel to, or have Nancy traveling to Loch Lomond. But the role that Loch Lomond plays in both stories is different. In the book, it happens to be just sort of a place that Nancy, Bess, and George pass by, and then there's an incident when the wind picks up and they see a bunch of houseboats, and one of them actually gets flipped by the wind, and we learn that the smugglers were sort of renting one of the houseboats there, but it is not a place that Nancy really returns to. It's not a main point of interest or of visiting in the book. Whereas in the game, Loch Lomond is sort of the spy base. There's a cabin there. It's a safe house. It's where Kate and Moira hung out. And there's also this, like, basically a fitness center where there's archery, and we've got a bit of our bagpipe stuff going on. And we do have bagpipe as well as being something that we see in both stories. So as far as the book goes, the bagpipe is sort of essential for the story, because that is where Nancy's hearing this musical song as well as this whistling, and which is sort of what leads her to the smugglers. Whereas in the game, the bagpipe is used just as a sort of very small puzzle. It happens to be at Loch Lomond, although Nancy has to get the chanter separately, and she plays a little tune on it. And she plays on the bagpipe also in the book. So there is some small overlap actually with the bagpipe. And then I also want to make a quick note about poetry and Robbie Burns. In the novel, Burns' song Scott Wahai, I might be butchering that pronunciation, I do apologize. It's used as a signal by the sheep thieves. And in the game, a partial stanza of A Fond Kiss by Burns is on a bench outside of the hotel where Nancy is staying. So we've got some crossover with Burns. And note that in the book, it is a song rather than a poem. It's a poem in the game. And I did also want to make a note about poetry coming in a second time in the game. It's not more from Robert Burns, but it's Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. So I just wanted to sort of make a note that there is kind of a crossover there, certainly with Burns being involved in both stories, but making sure that there is poetry of some form, be it song form or written form, poem form, that comes up in both. So now we will conclude. This is, a pretty easy conclusion to make. The 1964 novel and 2013 game tell two very different stories, and there's very little overlap. Not to say that there isn't any, because they do include some similarities such as locations. So again, Glasgow, Loch Lomond, and family history. So looking at the paternal side of Nancy's family. But other than that, there are very few elements that were included from the book into the game. Again, there is a little bit. So that is, again, the bagpipes. It doesn't play a big role in the game. It has a much bigger role in the novel. But it was still included in some capacity, which was really neat. And again, Robert Burns having been included. Similar locations, Glasgow and Loch Lomond. There is that crossover. But otherwise, there are no direct events from the book that were incorporated into the game, nor were any character names reused. And this really has become the norm with her interactives Nancy Drew game adaptations up to this point. Earlier games, you saw much more direct adaptations. We're not seeing so much of that now. It's more that the games are very, very loosely based off of a book and are ultimately telling their own story. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is my book to game comparison for The Silent Spy, which is loosely based off of the clue of the Whistling Bagpipes. And again, that is based off of a Nancy Drew mystery story, also known as the Yellow Hardback book number 41, published in 1964. And for anyone who's interested, this is one of the stories that was not revised. Books were revised in the 60s, but books that were initially printed in the 60s were their own version. There was no revision made. Just for anyone who might have been interested in that. So yes, two very different stories, although I didn't remember how much actually did carry over from book to game. It's more than I'd anticipated. I had only recalled that they were both set in Scotland. I've forgotten that the maternal family elements that we see in the game are inspired by stuff from the book. They're not the same, but we still do discuss Nancy's maternal side of the family. So that was actually really pleasant. And again, a few small overlaps. The one that stands out the most is Robert Burns. And how could her interactive not include Robbie Burns? But there we go. That's my comparison. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys the next time. Bye-bye now.